MTV, CB, the NFL, none of them knew anything about this beforehand. And in the end, everything went wrong. I'm truly sorry if anyone was offended. That was never what I intended. Those were the words offered after the fact. But the night that forced them out began much earlier. On February 1, 2004, in Houston, Texas, at roughly 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time during the Super Bowl XXXV II halftime show, more than 150 million viewers were locked on their screens when Janet Jackson lost control of her own narrative in under 5 seconds. One brief exposure captured in real time was all it took. The cameras recorded a single unguarded instant on live television. But the real ending of an era did not happen on that stage. It started in the hours and days afterward, as emergency calls lit up phones, crisis meetings took place behind closed doors, and powerful executives decided quietly and efficiently who would be sacrificed. Within a week, Janet's presence was erased with almost surgical precision. Her name disappeared from award shows. Her music was pulled from major networks. Inside the industry, her very identity became toxic, something people avoided mentioning out loud. The man who had been at her side on that stage, however, moved ahead as if nothing had happened. His career path stayed untouched. This is not a simple tale about a wardrobe malfunction or a clumsy split-second mistake. It is the record of what comes after the scandal, when silence turns into a strategy, blame becomes a form of currency, and Janet Jackson is forced to confront exactly who was willing to let her stand alone. Chapter 1. Janet Jackson controls silence and the fear of being exposed. To understand why what happened on February 1, 2004 cut so deeply into Janet Jackson's life, you have to go back decades to a small house in Gary, Indiana. In that house, silence was more than a habit. It was a survival tactic. Janet, born in 1966, as the youngest Jackson child, grew up under the rigid authority of her father, Joe Jackson. From the moment she could walk, her world rotated around discipline, fear, and control. In that home, mistakes were punished. Emotions were treated as weaknesses. Obedience was the closest thing anyone had to safety. Janet learned quickly that the safest move was not rebellion but restraint. She trained herself to absorb pressure quietly, to swallow her thoughts, to hide any sign of vulnerability. While her brothers rose to global fame, especially Michael Jackson, she watched what exposure did to a person. She saw how talent could become a cage, how fame convinced the public they were entitled to every private detail of a life once it was placed under a spotlight. By the time Janet stepped into her own solo career in the mid-1980s, she had already made a private promise she would not live the way Michael did. As his existence grew more public, more scrutinized, and more picked apart, Janet constructed her entire identity around one concept: control. Control of the sound. Control of the image. Control of the story. She wasn't chasing only success. She was building boundaries. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, she deliberately separated herself from the Jackson family legacy, from Motown nostalgia, and from the image of a child performer. Albums like Control and Rhythm Nation were not random branding experiments. They were declarations of independence. She presented herself as disciplined, intentional, and emotionally composed. Even when her songs tackled social issues or vulnerability, the vulnerability was choreographed. It came through precision, through staging, dance, and production that left nothing to chance. Because for Janet, chance meant exposure. That fixation on control only tightened as she moved into adulthood, especially in her private life. In 1984, at just 18 years old, she secretly married James DeBarge, a member of the musical DeBarge family. The marriage crumbled quickly under the pressure of addiction and instability. But what mattered most to Janet was not the breakup itself. It was how she handled it. She did not sit for tearful interviews. She did not publicize the details. She refused to let the media reshape her into a victim or a tabloid spectacle. The relationship ended in near invisibility, and Janet carried a hard lesson forward: silence protects. Years later, she would repeat that pattern on a much larger scale. In the early 1990s, Janet entered a relationship with dancer and songwriter Ren Elizondo Jr. They married in secret, and for nearly 9 years it existed outside of public confirmation. No red carpet introduction, no magazine covers, no televised confessions. Even as Janet became one of the most influential pop stars on the planet, she guarded that marriage as if it were classified information. When it ended in 2000, reports stated that Janet paid millions to keep the details locked away. Not out of simple shame, but out of the fear of losing control over the one thing she valued most: her own story. For Janet, privacy wasn't a luxury reserved for days off. It was armor. That fear turned into the emotional core of her work in 1997 with the release of The Velvet Rope. For the first time, she allowed herself to explore trauma, sexuality, depression, and emotional pain in a way that felt raw and personal. The album sounded like a diary someone had decided to put to music. But there was still one non-negotiable rule: Janet would be the one holding the pen. She would choose the details, choose the framing, choose the boundaries. The public could listen. The public could relate. But they would not interrogate. She opened the door to her inner world only as far as she was willing to, and no further. Vulnerability was acceptable, but only when she authored it. By the early 2000s, Janet stood at the height of her power. All For You dominated radio. Her world tours sold out around the globe. Inside the industry, her reputation was fixed: professional, prepared, uncompromisingly meticulous. She was not reckless. She was not impulsive. Every appearance was planned down to the smallest beat. So when she was chosen to headline the 2004 Super Bowl halftime show, it was not sold as a risk. It was framed as a reward, a celebration of a veteran whose control and consistency made her the safest possible choice for one of television's biggest stages. What the audience could not see was how deeply this idea of control was wired into her psyche. For Janet, being exposed without consent was not just embarrassing. It was a return to childhood, being watched, judged, and punished with no chance to explain herself. It was the exact atmosphere she had spent her entire life trying to escape. Long before the Super Bowl, Janet did not fear scandal as much as she feared losing ownership of her narrative. That fear is the key that explains why the events of that night were so devastating. On February 1, 2004, Janet Jackson did not simply endure a public mishap. She watched the collapse of the one defense system that had protected her since she was a child: control, maintained through silence. In a matter of seconds, her body, her image, and her story slipped out of her hands. The media spoke in her place. Executives spoke in her place. The industry constructed a version of her identity without ever asking what it cost. The woman who had spent nearly 4 decades mastering the art of containment found herself exposed in the most public way possible. This chapter of Janet Jackson's life is not about a pop star panicking over a scandal. It is about a woman who learned very early that survival depended on staying quiet, composed, and in command. When that command was stripped away, it did more than damage her career. It tore open wounds she had spent a lifetime stitching shut. And that is why, when the fallout began, Janet Jackson did not respond with chaos or outrage. She responded in the only way she had ever known how. She went silent. And that silence, once the strongest shield she had, would become the very tool others used to write her fate for her. Justin Timberlake, the man who needed a boost. 2001-2003. Los Angeles. New York. If Janet Jackson stepped into the early 2000s, trying to protect everything she had built, Justin Timberlake entered that same era, trying to escape everything he had already been. By 2001, Justin was 20 years old, recently detached from NSY, NC, and standing at a fragile crossroads that many young male pop stars never successfully cross. Boy band wave had turned him into a household name. It had given him money, a fan base, and an easily recognizable face. But it had also locked him inside a box he was desperate to break out of. To the industry, he was still the clean-cut, heavily choreographed frontman of teen pop. To Justin, that image wasn't just a brand. It was a ceiling. When his debut solo album, Justified, arrived in 2002, the numbers looked promising. The project sold the singles, worked on radio, and the sound leaned older with R&B influences, designed to distance him from his past. On paper, it was a success. Inside the business, though, the verdict was cautious. Executives liked the sales. They liked the streaming and radio impact. But the quiet consensus was that Justin was still in transition, still moving from boy band star to solo cultural force, not quite finished with the transformation. He needed more than chart positions. He needed moments. He needed something that felt undeniable. He needed credibility. And most of all, he needed proximity to artists who already carried unquestioned weight. That is where Janet Jackson entered the frame. By the time early talks began about the Super Bowl XXXV II halftime show in late 2003, Janet's position could not have been more different. She wasn't a newcomer trying to prove herself. She wasn't experimenting with a first solo identity. She was a veteran, a global icon, and one of the very few black women ever trusted with the Super Bowl halftime stage. For MTV, the NFL, and CBS pairing Justin with Janet was a pitch about chemistry and balanced youth and momentum meeting experience and dominance. To Justin, it was something much bigger, a chance to stand beside someone whose status might help lift him into a different league. Proximity to power can rewrite a narrative faster than any album rollout. What matters, however, is what their relationship was not. It was not romantic. It was not intimate. There were no late-night confession calls, no shared childhood history, no deep emotional bond that tied them together. They did not move in the same social circles. People who worked near both artists described their connection as professional, polite, and distant. Janet remained focused on preparation and execution. Justin remained focused on the opportunity in front of him. On paper, they were framed as equals on the stage. In reality, they were not equals in leverage. And slowly beneath the surface, an imbalance began to form. Janet's name carried enormous weight, but that weight came with exposure. She had decades of public scrutiny behind her, and every move she made was judged through the lenses of race, gender, and sexuality. Justin, by contrast, held a safer position. He was young, male, white, and consistently framed by the media as playful, likable, charming, not dangerous. That difference mattered more than anyone admitted in real time. As rehearsals approached, the production followed the usual Super Bowl pattern: tight windows, stacked approvals, and creative ideas filtered through multiple layers of corporate oversight. According to people who later spoke anonymously to music journalists, nothing about the show was initially presented to Janet as reckless or intentionally provocative. The mandate, they said, was spectacle, not scandal. Yet quiet rumors later circulated that late-stage ideas were discussed loosely, without the level of clear, explicit consent Janet normally demanded. Suggestions were floated. Concepts were mentioned. But no one put full responsibility in writing. No one made the boundaries unmistakable. That lack of documentation would become the most dangerous detail of all. For Justin, the performance represented a defining pivot, not just another collaboration, but a public graduation ceremony. This was his chance to stand on the most watched stage in American entertainment and be seen not as the former boy band kid, but as a leading man who belonged in the same conversation as the icons standing beside him. People around him later suggested he felt intense pressure to create something unforgettable, something that would mark a clean break between his past image and his future ambitions. But unforgettable does not always mean survivable, especially when the fallout has to land on someone. As the date drew closer, Janet turned inward, the way she always did. She rehearsed relentlessly, monitored choreography, watched the camera blocking, and treated the halftime show, like every other massive appearance in her life, as something to be controlled, not something left to improvisation. Justin moved through the process with a different energy. less guarded, more casual, more willing to trust the system around him to catch him if something went wrong. That difference in mindset would become critical when everything did. What the world usually remembers is a single move, a single lyric, a single camera angle. But the truth is that the damage began before the spotlights hit the field. It started in the unspoken assumptions both artists carried. Janet assumed that her history of controlled professionalism and discipline would protect her. Justin assumed that his growing popularity and momentum would carry him through anything. Neither of them fully calculated how fast the system would pick a side when pressure hit. In the hours after the halftime show, as media outrage swelled and executives scrambled to regain control of the story, those assumptions collided. Janet was suddenly flooded with questions loaded with implication questions that bent intent and blame toward her almost by default. Justin, on the other hand, released statements that were broad and careful. He avoided sharp language. He stayed away from detailed explanations. He did not directly confront the narrative forming around Janet. He did not insist on shared responsibility in public. And from the industry's point of view, he didn't have to. This was where resentment began to form, not because Justin experienced a moment of fear and pulled back. Many people in his position would have panicked. The resentment came from the ease with which his retreat fit into a system that was already ready to cushion him while discarding her. Janet recognized that structure instantly. She had spent her entire life learning how to read power, how to sense when silence was being used as a weapon, and how to track where the protection in a room was flowing. She watched how quickly the conversation shifted from what exactly happened to who must pay for it, and she saw with painful clarity who the machine had already chosen to shield. People who later spoke about those weeks described Janet as composed on the outside and quietly devastated underneath. She did not rage on television. She did not publicly accuse Justin. She did what she had always done. She calculated. According to accounts, she would later confirm Janet made a conscious choice. She would limit Justin's involvement in the fallout. She told him to speak less, not more, to let the storm burn itself out, to allow the system to do what it always does in a scandal, isolate the most vulnerable, and move on. That choice has often been misread as forgiveness. It was not. It was recognition. Janet recognized that the machine had already plotted its course. She recognized that Justin, whether he intended it or not, was being protected and lifted by that same system. The resentment that followed was not loud or theatrical. It was restrained, focused, and deeply personal. It was not about the choreography on stage. It was about the moment afterward, when Justin Timberlake had a choice to step forward and share the weight or to let the industry step over her, while he walked away untouched. He chose the safer path. And for Janet Jackson, a woman who had built her entire life around preventing exactly that kind of exposure and abandonment, that choice cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever could. The Super Bowl night, the move, the silence, and the betrayal. February 1, 2004. Reliant Stadium, Houston, Texas. By the time the halftime countdown hit 0 that night, nothing about the atmosphere suggested disaster. Inside Reliant Stadium, more than 70 people were on their feet, roaring over the sound of fireworks and bass. Outside, more than 150 million viewers watched the broadcast in real time, scattered across living rooms, bars, and parties all over the country. Janet Jackson walked onto that field, the way she had walked onto every major stage for decades, prepared, composed, convinced that every detail had been accounted for. Every cue, every step, every camera move had been rehearsed with military precision. This was not her first live performance. It was not her first high-stakes show, and no one believed it was supposed to be the last moment she would ever truly control. The show unfolded exactly as the production team had promised. The lights hit on cue. The dancers rotated through their marks with machine-like timing. The choreography snapped into place. Nothing about the performance in those first minutes felt unstable. When Justin Timberlake stepped out to join her for the final section, it looked like a symbolic passing of the torch, the veteran icon, and the younger star shoulder to shoulder sharing what had become the biggest annual platform in American entertainment. On camera, there was no visible tension, no hesitation, no obvious sign that anyone on that stage believed they were seconds away from creating one of the most dissected moments in broadcast history. Then came the final lyric. "I'm gonna have you naked by the end of this song." The line was not improvised. It had been performed in rehearsals. It had been approved by producers, reviewed by network standards, and cleared in an environment where every second was scrutinized. It existed as metaphor, a suggestive punchline designed to push the edge of primetime respectability without crossing it. What followed, however, was not metaphor. As the music hit its final beat, Justin stepped forward and executed the closing move. There was no delay, no warning to the camera operators, no visible signal that something off-script was about to happen. In a fraction of a second, his hand pulled at Janet's costume, and the broadcast crossed a line that could never be taken back. The cameras did not immediately cut away. The stadium did not suddenly go silent. The song ended, the crowd screamed, and the show technically completed its arc. But Janet did not. She did not scream. She did not recover in time to cover herself. She did not regain control of the moment before millions of eyes had already witnessed it. In that instant, her body and her image were no longer hers to manage. They belonged to the recording, to the replay, to the cycle of slow-motion breakdowns and zoomed-in screenshots that would be broadcast, debated, and condemned without context or mercy. When the lights finally dimmed and the performance ended, Janet walked off stage in a state that people later described as shock. Crew members said she appeared calm on the surface, but frozen underneath a kind of focused numbness that comes when someone realizes something irreversible has just happened and there is no way to rewind it. Backstage, there was no immediate screaming match. No public confrontation. Just confusion spreading through headsets and hallways as phones lit up and executives began to process what had just gone out live to the entire country. Within minutes, crisis mode activated. Network executives began calling one another in rapid succession. Lawyers were pulled into the conversation. Public relations teams started drafting statements and running through potential damage control strategies. The central question changed quickly. It was no longer what exactly happened, but who is going to be held responsible for what happened. In those first chaotic hours, something crucial failed to materialize a unified response. No single coordinated message emerged. No immediate joint statement appeared. Janet waited. According to people close to her, she expected at least one simple thing, not a media circus, not a confession tour, but a united front. Two artists standing side by side, acknowledging that what had happened was a mistake, not a deliberate act of indecency designed to shock the country. That moment never arrived. Instead, their paths split, almost immediately. Less than 24 hours later, Janet issued a public apology. Her statement was serious and direct. She accepted responsibility for the incident, emphasized that it was never intended to offend, and framed it as a regrettable mistake. It was textbook crisis language, and it positioned her squarely in the center of the blame. The press seized on it instantly. Justin's response took a different shape. His comments were more distant, more detached. He leaned on the phrase, wardrobe malfunction, a term that turned a jarring incident into something that sounded mechanical and accidental. He avoided describing the action in explicit terms. He did not tie his name to accountability in the same way Janet did. There was no joint apology, no shared interview, no powerful visual of them standing together, distributing responsibility. The silence between them became louder than anything either one said. As the news cycle accelerated, the narrative hardened in a matter of days. Janet's name began appearing in headlines alongside words like indecency, shock, and outrage. Clips from her past work, especially material from The Velvet Rope, were pulled out of context and reframed as hints that this had somehow been intentional, that she was using the Super Bowl to push a sexual envelope she had already explored in her art. Commentators questioned her judgment. Politicians condemned her in speeches and statements. Advocacy groups demanded consequences, MTV, and crackdowns. The NFL, behind closed doors, none of them knew anything about this beforehand. Meetings were held in network offices where Janet was not present. I'm truly sorry if anyone was invited. That was never what I intended. Who should still appear on their stages, those were the words offered after the fact, and who should quietly vanish from their schedules. But the night that forced them out began much earlier. Were reviewed. On February 1, 2004, were reconsidered. In Houston, Within Texas, days, her planned appearance at roughly 8:30 Grammy Awards disappeared. Eastern Time during the Super Bowl XXXV. No formal explanation that truly made sense. More than 150 just million a message passed through intermediaries that her presence was no longer lost control of her own narrative. Radio stations began reducing her airplay or removing her from their exposure captured in real time was all television networks stepped. The cameras recorded a single unguarded instant on live invitations that once felt automatic. But the real ending of an era did not happen on that stage. The message to anyone started in the hours and days afterward. Someone had emergency calls, and that someone was not going to be Justin Timberlake. Took place behind closed Justin's doors. World looked radically different. Decided his tour dates remained efficiently. Who would be songs stayed in heavy rotation. Within a week, Janet's presence was erased with almost surgical precision. Sudden erasure. Her name disappeared from award shows. It appeared that two people had been involved in the same incident. Yet inside the industry, forced to carry her very identity became toxic. This was the moment when Janet people avoided mentioning out loud. The damage was no longer about a 5-second mishap on stage. However, moved ahead as if it was about abandonment. His career path stayed untouched. Spoke with her during that period. This is not a simple tale about a wardrobe malfunction or a clumsy split-second mistake. It is the record of what comes after the scandal. She did not point fingers at Justin on camera. Becomes a form of currency, and Janet Jackson is forced to confront she assessed the situation with the same precision she had brought to every aspect of her career. Janet Jackson controlled how efficiently the system had chosen its scapegoat. She recognized that pushing back too aggressively too loudly would not correct the injustice. So deeply into Janet Jackson's it would likely intensify it. You have to go back decades. According to Janet's later account in Gary, Indiana, she made a decision in that many still silence was more than a habit. She told Justin to keep his distance from the controversy. Janet, born in 1966, him not to escalate, as the youngest Jackson child grew up under the rigid authority of her father Joe Jackson in the blast zone. From the moment she could walk, her world rotated around forward too forcefully, fear and control. If he demanded shared responsibility, in that home, the same machine that was dismantling her career, emotions were treated as weaknesses. Obedience was the closest thing anyone had to safety. This was not an act of kindness. Janet learned quickly that the safest move was not rebellion but Janet restraint. Understood that the system had already locked onto its choice. Quietly to swallow she understood that the engines of blame were already turning and fighting them head-on. While her brothers rose deep in the fame, especially Michael Jackson, but understanding a system does not remove the sting of what it does to you. She saw how betrayal in Janet's eyes was never just the physical fame convinced the public they were entitled to. It was everything that happened or failed to happen of a life once it was placed. It was the absence of a united front. By the time Janet stepped into her someone standing beside her in the mid-1980s, the choice to remain insulated, she had already made a private promise she would not live the way Janet did not need a savior. As his existence grew more public, a witness, more scrutinized, and she did not pick it apart. Janet constructed in the days that followed as the clip played around one and over again on television. As pundits dissected the moment from every angle of the image, and as the industry closed ranks, Janet Jackson, she wasn't chasing only success. Far more painful than she was building boundaries. She watched through the late 1980s rewritten and early 1990s. The woman who had devoted decades to maintaining control over her legacy was reduced to a scandal shorthand, and from the image of a child silence she had always relied on to shield herself, Control and now turned into an empty space. Were not random other people rushed to fill speaking for her while they were declarations of independence. That is the she part presented of herself as disciplined, intentional, and emotionally composed. The most devastating damage did not happen when her songs tackled social issues or it happened in the hours afterward. The vulnerability was choreographed, not present in the statements. It came through precision, through staging, and in the moment and production that left when the system needed a single sacrifice. Because for Janet, been left standing alone meant exposure. And once Janet Jackson understood that the relationship between her and Justin Timberlake was never simply private life. It was permanently altered by the knowledge that when power demanded someone she secretly married James DeBarge, a member of the musical DeBarge family. The marriage crumbled quickly under the pressure of addiction. If Super Bowl night was the explosion, the weeks that followed were the slow, methodical execution. By mid-February 2004, she did not sit for tearful interviews that the scandal had already slipped out of the public arena. She refused to let the media reshape her into a victim or a tabloid spectacle. Private calls where decisions
The relationship ended in near invisibility,
and later
Janet
Janet
carried
carried
a
a
hard
hard lesson forward silence.
What stunned her
protects.
was not the outrage on
Years
television.
later, she would repeat
She
that
had
pattern
seen
on a
public
much
anger
larger
before.
scale.
What stunned
In the
her
early
was how quickly the industry
1990,
decided who
S.
would absorb
Janet
the impact.
entered a relationship
The first
with
hit
dancer and
landed
songwriter
without warning.
Ren
Janet
Elizondo
had been
Jr.
scheduled to appear at the
They
2004
married in secret,
Grammy Awards,
and for nearly
a
9
night she had
years,
earned over
it
and over
existed
again
through
outside of
decades of
public
work.
confirmation. Then
No
almost
red
overnight, the
carpet
invitation
introduction.
evaporated.
No
No
magazine
logical
covers.
explanation.
No televised
formal
confessions.
announcement spelling out the reasoning.
Even as Janet became
Just a
one of
message
the most
passed through
influential pop
intermediaries.
stars on the
Her
planet,
presence was no longer
she guarded
appropriate.
that marriage.
The
as
meaning
if
was
it were
unmistakable.
classified information.
The punishment
When
had
it ended
begun.
in 2000,
As word of the snub
stated
leaked
that
out, the
Janet
narrative
paid millions to
solidified.
keep the details
Janet
locked
was
away.
not simply being
Not out of
criticized, she
simple
was being
shame,
disciplined,
but out of the
openly
fear
and
of losing
symbolically,
control over
as
the
a
one
warning
thing
to
she
others.
valued most, her own
From
story.
there, the doors started
For
closing.
Janet, privacy
one by
wasn't a
one.
luxury reserved
Music
for days
programmers
off.
at MTV
It was
and
armor.
VH1
That fear
quietly
turned
scaled
into
back
the emotional
her video
core of
rotation.
her work. In
Some outlets
1997,
stopped playing her
with the
entirely.
release of the Velvet
Radio
Rope,
programmers who had
for the
once
first
championed
time,
her songs,
she allowed herself
suddenly
to
cited
explore
listener
trauma,
sensitivity,
sensuality,
depression,
and corporate
and
guidelines,
emotional pain. When
in
asked
a way
why
that
her
felt
tracks
raw
were disappearing.
and personal.
National
The
TV
album sounded like a
appearances dried
diary
up.
someone had decided
Invitations
to put to
that
music.
had once been automatic,
But there was still
now
one
required
non-negotiable
review.
rule.
On their
Janet
own,
would be the
each
one
move
holding
seemed
the pen.
minor.
She would
Taken
choose
together,
the details,
they
choose
formed
the
a pattern,
framing,
a
choose
wall
the
carefully
boundaries.
built around her.
The public could
Inside
listen.
the industry,
The public
an
could
explanation
relate.
began to circulate,
But they
in
would
hushed
not interrogate.
conversations.
She opened the door
According
to
to
her inner
journalists
world,
and executives
only as
who
far
later
as she was
spoke
willing
off the
to,
record pressure
and no
was
further.
coming from the top of the corporate
Vulnerability
structure,
was acceptable,
specifically from Les
but only when
Moonves,
she authored it.
then one of the most
By the
powerful
early
figures
2000s,
inside Viacom, the
Janet
parent
stood at
company
the height of her
of
power.
CBSA. All for You
The framing,
dominated
as it was
radio.
described later,
Her
wasn't
world
revenge.
tours sold out around
It was
the globe.
control.
Inside the
message, as
industry,
insiders
her
remembered,
reputation was
it was
fixed,
brutally
professional,
simple.
prepared,
Someone needed to be
uncompromisingly
made an
meticulous.
example of.
And
She was
Janet
not
fit the
reckless.
criteria too
She was
perfectly
not
to
impulsive.
ignore.
She
Every
was
appearance
highly
was
visible.
planned down to
She
the
was
smallest
black.
beat.
She was
So
a
when
woman.
she was chosen to
She had
headline the
explored
2004
sexuality
Super Bowl
openly in her
halftime
art.
show, it was
And
not
most
sold
importantly,
as a risk.
she did not have
It
the
was
same
framed as a
institutional
reward,
protection,
a celebration
men
of a
seated in
veteran
the
whose
boardrooms.
control and consistency
in the cold
made her the
calculus of
safest
corporate
possible
damage
choice
control.
for one of television's
She was
biggest
expendable, not
stages.
necessarily because she
What
was
the audience
guilty,
could not see
but because she was
how
useful.
deeply this idea
Janet
of
felt the
control
shift
was
immediately.
wired into her psyche.
Calls that
For
once
Janet
returned
being
in minutes
exposed
went
without
unanswered.
consent was not just
Meetings
embarrassing.
were postponed indefinitely.
It was a return to childhood.
People
being
who
watched,
had previously
judged, and
praised
punished
her
with no chance
professionalism
to
and
explain herself.
creativity.
It was the
began
exact
speaking in
atmosphere
guarded,
she had spent her entire
sanitized
life
phrases.
trying to escape.
She was not openly accused.
Long before the
She was
Super Bowl,
quietly isolated.
Janet did not fear
And
scandal
in an
as
industry
much as she
built
feared
entirely on
losing
connection,
ownership of her
access, and
narrative.
collaboration.
That
Isolation
fear is the key
is its
that
own kind
explains
of
why the
eraser.
events of that night
What
were
made
so
it even more
devastating.
unbearable was the
On
contrast
February
playing
1,
out in real time.
2004,
Janet
Janet
Jackson
watched
did
her
not
career
simply
stall
endure
in
in slow
public
motion.
She
Just
watched
the
the
collapse
collapse
of
of
the
the
one
one
defense
defense
system
system that
His
had
songs
protected her
remained in
since she was a
rotation.
child. Control.
His public image
maintained
remained
through
stable.
silence.
There were no
In
sweeping
a matter of
bans,
seconds,
no
her
public
body, her image,
blacklisting,
and her story
no visible
slipped out of her
corporate
hands.
backlash.
To the
media
outside
spoke in
world,
her
it looked
place.
like two people had been involved in the
Executives
same
spoke in her
incident,
place.
but only
The
one
industry
had been
constructed
selected
a
to carry
version
the
of her
weight.
identity without
To
ever
Janet,
asking what it cost.
It felt like a verdict
The
that
woman
had
who
been
had spent
decided
nearly
before
4
she ever
decades
had a
mastering
chance to
the art
speak.
of containment.
Behind the scenes,
found
the
herself
pressure
exposed
around her
in the most
intensified.
public way possible.
Advisors
This
warned
chapter
her
of
not
Janet
to push
Jackson's
too hard.
life
Is
is
not
not
about
about
a pop
challenge
star
to
panicking
companies
over
that
a
control the
scandal.
airways.
It is about
Lawyers
a woman
laid
who
out the
learned
risks
very
of
early
taking on a
that
media
survival
conglomerate
depended on
during a
staying
moral
quiet,
panic.
composed,
Friends told her
and
to
in
be
command.
patient, to wait it
When
out
that
to
command
survive
was
the
stripped
moment
away,
rather than
it
confront
did more than damage her
The
career.
message was clear
It
and
tore open
terrifyingly
wounds
consistent.
she had spent a lifetime
If you fight
stitching
this
shut.
directly, it will get
And
worse.
that is why when the fallout
This is
began,
when Janet made the
Jackson
call
did
that
not
would stay with
respond
her for
chaos
years.
or outrage.
She called
She
Justin.
responded in the only
People
way
close
she had
to her
ever
later
known how.
described the conversation
She went
as silent.
controlled, almost
And
surgical.
that silence, once the
There was
strongest
no
shield she
shouting,
had,
no emotional
would become
breakdown,
the
no
very
dramatic
tool
confrontation.
others
others used to write her fate
Just
for her.
clarity. Justin
Janet
Timberlake
told
the
him
man who
plainly
needed a
what the
boost.
industry was doing.
2001,
She explained that executives
2003.
were already searching
Los
for a single
Angeles,
target, one person
New
to
York.
carry the blame.
If Janet Jackson
She told him
stepped
that
into
if
the
he
early
stepped too far
2000s,
forward,
trying
if he
to protect
challenged the
everything
story,
she had built,
if he demanded
Justin
shared
Timberlake entered
responsibility,
that same era,
the machine would not
trying to
protect him
escape
either.
everything he had already
It
been.
would merely widen the
By
blast zone.
2001, her message
Justin
was
was
simple.
20 years old,
Don't say anything
recently
else.
detached from
Don't
NSY,
inflame it.
NC, and
If you
standing
speak
at a
too
fragile
loudly, they will
crossroads
drag you down
that
with
many
me.
young male pop stars
It sounded
never
like
successfully
protection.
cross.
In reality,
boy
it
band
was
wave had
triage.
turned him into a household
Janet was
name.
not absolving him.
It had given him
She was
money, a fan
calculating.
base, and
These
an
were the
easily
survival
recognizable
skills she had
face.
learned as a child.
But it had also locked
standing
him
in a
inside
house
a
where
box
authority
authority
rarely
desperate to break
listened,
out of,
and decisions were
to the
final
industry.
before
He
anyone
was still
else
the
had a chance
clean-cut,
to
heavily
speak.
choreographed frontman.
She understood
of
how
teen pop.
power behaved when it
To
had
Justin,
already
that
chosen
image
an
wasn't
outcome.
just a brand.
She knew when
It was a
resistance
ceiling.
would only sharpen
When his
the blade.
debut solo album
And she knew
Justified
that once a
arrived
sacrifice
in
had been
2002,
selected, the
only
only
remaining
remaining choice
choice
was
the
how
project
many people
sold the
would burn
singles
with
worked
it.
on radio.
Justin followed
and
her
the sound
advice,
leaned older with R&B
and that is where the hatred
influences
began to harden,
designed to distance him
not
from his
because he
past.
listened to her
On paper,
but because he benefited
it was a
from what her
success.
silence allowed.
Inside the business,
Janet
though,
understood
the
that
verdict
Justin
was
had
cautious.
not personally engineered the
Executives
campaign
liked
against
the
her.
sales.
She knew
They
the
liked
system
the
was bigger
streaming
than
and
either
radio
of them.
impact.
But understanding
quiet
the system did not
consensus
erase what
was
she
that
had to
Justin
watch
was
happen
still
in
in
transition,
forward,
still
while she
moving
was
from
slowly
boy
pushed
band
out.
star to solo cultural
His silence
force,
became his shield.
not quite finished with
Her
the
silence
transformation.
became her sentence.
He needed more than
As
chart
February
positions.
turned into March, the
He
damage
needed
solidified.
moments.
He needed
Industry
something that
insiders
felt
stopped discussing
undeniable.
Janet as a collaborator.
He needed
and started
credibility,
referring to her quietly
and most
as
of
a
all,
liability.
he needed proximity.
The Super
to
Bowl
artists
thing became
who
code
already
shorthand
carried
for
unquestioned weight.
Projects
That is where
hesitated.
Janet Jackson entered
Deals
the frame.
stalled.
By the time early
Opportunities
talks
dissolved
began
without
about the Super Bowl,
explanation.
and each time Janet asked
II
why the
the
answers
halftime
came back,
show in late
vague, polite,
2003
and final.
Janet's
She
position
watched
could not have
headlines
been more
stack up
different
without her voice
She
included.
wasn't a newcomer
She
trying
watched
to prove
politicians
herself.
condemn her
She wasn't
without
experimenting
context.
with a first
She
solo
watched
identity.
pundits dissect
She
her
was a
body
veteran
and
a
her past
global
work as
icon,
if all of it
and
had
one
been
of the very
building
few
toward
black
that
women
one moment of
ever
proof.
trusted with the Super Bowl
And through it all,
halftime stage.
the people who could have shifted
MTV,
the narrative,
the
who could have
NFL,
stood beside
and
her
CBS
and
pairing
insisted
Justin
this was
with
a
Janet,
collective failure,
was a pitch about
not a
chemistry
solo
and
act.
balance used
stayed
and
quiet.
momentum meeting
That
experience
silence
and
did
dominance.
something permanent.
To Justin, it
It
was something
transformed
much bigger,
pain
a
into
chance to
something
stand
heavier.
beside someone
Janet
whose
did
status
not
might
come to
help
hate
lift him
Justin
into a different
because of
league.
a single move
Proximity
on
to
stage.
power.
She
can
came to
rewrite
hate
a narrative
what
faster than
unfolded
any album
afterward.
rollout.
She hated
What
that
matters,
when the system
however,
finally
is what
revealed
their
itself
relationship
cold,
was not.
strategic,
It
unforgiving.
was not romantic.
He had the option to
It was
stay
not
inside
intimate.
his protection, while
There
she
were
was
no
pushed
late-night
outside.
confession calls.
She hated
No
that
shared
his career
childhood
continued
history.
to climb inside
No deep
the same
emotional
industry
bond that tied them
that had
together.
methodically shut its doors
They did
on
not
her.
move in the same
She
social
hated that the full
circles.
responsibility
People
for
who worked
surviving
near
the
both
fallout
artists
landed only on her
described their
shoulders.
connection as professional.
This was
polite,
when
and
Janet
distant.
understood the full cost
Janet
of being
remained
chosen
focused
as the
on
warning.
preparation and
It
execution.
was not just about lost
Justin
airtime or
remained
cancelled
focused on the
appearances.
opportunity in front of him.
It was the realization
paper,
that
they were
loyalty,
framed
fairness,
as
and
equals
shared
on the stage.
responsibility were
In
conditional,
reality,
offered only
they were
as
not
long as
equals
they
in
did not
leverage.
conflict with power.
And slowly beneath
When that
the
truth
surface,
settled, something
an
inside her
imbalance began to
closed.
form.
By the
Janet's
end of March
name carried enormous
2004,
weight.
Janet
but
Jackson
that weight
was no
came
longer
with
trying to
exposure.
simply clear her
She
name.
had decades of public
She was trying to
scrutiny behind
exist
her,
inside a system
and every
that had
move
quietly
she made
reclassified
was
her
judged
as
through the
expendable.
lenses of race, gender,
The
and
anger she carried
sexuality.
was not the kind
Justin,
that
by
explodes and
contrast,
disappears.
held a safer
It was
position.
disciplined. He was young,
contained,
male, white, and consistently
long-term,
framed by
the
the
kind of
media
anger that doesn't
as
burn
playful,
out.
likable,
It
charming,
settles into place,
not dangerous.
and it settled around
That
one
difference
fact when
mattered more
everything
than
collapsed.
anyone admitted in
She
real
stood
time.
alone. As
And the one
rehearsals
person
approached,
who
the
could have
production
stood beside
followed
her
the
chose
usual
not to.
Super Bowl pattern tight
That is why
windows,
this chapter matters.
stacked approvals, and
Because the
creative
Super Bowl
ideas
scandal did
filtered
not
through
destroy
multiple
Janet
layers
Jackson
of
on
corporate
its own.
oversight. The decision
According
to
to
single
people
her
who
out
later spoke
isolate her and
anonymously to
abandon
music
her
journalists.
did.
Nothing
And once
about
that
the show
truth
was
crystallized,
initially
the
presented to
relationship
Janet
between Janet
as reckless
Jackson
or
and
intentionally
Justin
provocative.
Timberlake was no longer just
The mandate,
damage.
they said, was spectacle,
It was
not
poisoned by
scandal.
the knowledge
Yet
that when
quiet
power
rumors
needed someone
later
to
circulated
sacrifice,
that
only
late
one of
stage
them was
ideas
offered
were
up,
discussed
and
loosely,
only one of them
without
walked
the
away
level of
untouched.
clear, explicit consent
Silent hatred
Janet
20
normally
years
demanded.
of quiet damage.
Suggestions
What
were
came
floated.
after the Super Bowl
Concepts
didn't look
were
like a
mentioned,
spectacular collapse.
but no one put full
There were
responsibility
no
in
daily
writing.
front-page breakdowns.
No one made the
No
boundaries
viral footage
unmistakable.
of public meltdowns.
That lack of documentation
no
would
explosive
become the most
sit-down
dangerous
interviews where
detail of
someone
all.
finally snapped
For
and told
Justin,
everything.
the performance
What happened to
represented a
Janet
defining
Jackson
pivot,
was colder,
not
more
just another
methodical,
collaboration,
and far more
but
efficient.
a public graduation
She wasn't
ceremony.
loudly cancelled.
This was his
She was
chance
quietly
to stand on the
removed.
most watched
such stage
in the immediate
American
months after
entertainment
2004,
and be seen
Janet
not as
was
the
still on
former
paper
boy band
a
superstar, but as a leading
Her
man
name
who
still
belonged
meant
in the
something.
same conversation
Her catalog
as the
was still
icon
there.
standing beside
Her
him.
legacy hadn't vanished.
People around him
But
later
the center of
suggested he
gravity
felt
had
intense
shifted.
pressure. She was
to
no
create
longer
something
treated as an
unforgettable,
artist defining the
something that
moment.
would mark a clean
She
break
was handled
between his
like a
past
relic
image
from
and his
another
future
era,
ambitions.
a reference point,
But
a lesson, a
unforgettable
cautionary
does
tale
not always mean
attached to a
survivable,
scandal,
especially
rather than
when
a
the
creator
fallout has
still
to land
shaping
on
the culture
someone.
in real time.
As the date drew closer,
Invitations
Janet
that once
turned
arrived
inward,
without question
the way she
stopped
always
appearing.
did.
She
New
rehearsed
music still
relentlessly,
came out,
monitored choreography,
but it slipped into the
watched
world
the
without
camera
urgency,
blocking, and treated the halftime
without the full
show
promotional
like every
machine
other
behind
massive
it,
appearance
without
in her
the
life,
same institutional
as something
belief
to be controlled,
that had
not
once
something
made
left
each
to
release
improvisation.
feel like an event. Justin moved through the
Executives
process
didn't attack
with a
her
different
openly
energy
anymore.
less
They
guarded,
didn't have to.
more casual.
They spoke about her in
more
careful,
willing to trust the
risk-averse
system
language,
around him
as
to
if
catch
even
him if
invoking
something
her
went
name
wrong.
too loudly might
That
cause
difference
trouble.
in mindset
No one
would
was
become
out
critical
front
when
destroying
everything
her.
did.
They simply
What the
stepped
world
away.
usually remembers
That
as a
quiet
single
retreat
move,
was
a
devastating
single
because
lyric
it
left
left
no
no
clear
camera
villain
angle.
to point to no
But
single
the truth
door to
is
knock
that
on.
the damage began before
Janet
the
kept
spotlights
moving.
hit the field.
She recorded,
It
she
started
toured on
in
her
her
own
unspoken
terms,
assumptions.
and she showed up
Both
when she
artists
decided it was
carried.
worth it.
Janet assumed
But
that
everything
her
felt
history of
smaller.
controlled
The
professionalism
framing
and
had
discipline
changed.
would protect
Where
her.
journalists once
Justin
described her as
assumed
an
that his
innovator,
growing
a
popularity
leader,
and momentum,
a force they
would
now
carry
began
him
to
to
label
label
her
her
a
a legacy act.
Neither of
Long
them
before
fully
her
calculated
career was
how
anywhere
fast
near
the system
finished.
would pick a side when
Her
pressure
sexuality,
hit.
once
In
praised
the
as
hours
bold,
after the
intentional,
halftime
and
show,
artistically
as media
controlled,
outrage
became
swelled,
something networks
and executives
preferred not to
scrambled
touch
to
at all.
regain control of the story.
The image of Janet
Those
Jackson
assumptions
as a
collided.
powerful, autonomous
Janet
symbol
was
of
suddenly
desire
flooded with
was
questions
frozen in
loaded
place,
with
pinned to the
implication
moment of the
questions
Super Bowl
that bent
controversy,
intent and blame
and never
toward
allowed
her
to
almost by
evolve beyond
default.
it.
The
Justin,
cruelty
on the
of
other
it all
hand,
was
released
sharpened by the
statements that were
contrast
broad
she
and
watched
careful.
unfold in real
He
time.
avoided sharp language.
While Janet
He
absorbed
stayed
the
away from
long-term
detailed
scar tissue of
explanations.
2004,
He did not directly
Justin
confront the
Timberlake
narrative forming
moved
around
into a
Janet.
new era of success.
He did not insist on
He
shared
collected
responsibility
Grammys
in public.
He released
And
albums
from the industry's
rolled out
point
as
of view,
cultural events.
he didn't have to.
He crossed over
This was
into
where
film.
resentment began to
He
form,
secured a
not because
reputation
Justin
as a
experienced
mainstream,
moment of
respectable,
fear
bankable
and
star.
pulled back. In
Many
2018,
people
he
in his
returned to the
position
Super
would
Bowl
have panicked.
halftime stage.
The resentment
spotlight
came from
Janet
the
was
ease
never
with which
invited
his
to share
retreat
again.
fit into a system
To casual
that was
viewers,
already
it might
ready
have
to
looked
cushion
like
him
nothing
while
more than
discarding her.
scheduling. Janet recognized that it felt like confirmation.
She had spent
And
her
still
entire
she
life
said
learning how
almost
to
nothing.
read power, how
Year
to sense
after
when
year,
silence was being
interviewers
used as a
attempted
weapon,
to pull
and
a
how to
reaction
track
out
where
of
the
her.
protection in a room
They
was
circled
flowing.
back to the same
She
questions.
watched how quickly
What
the
did she think
conversation
of the
shifted
Super
from
Bowl?
what exactly
Did she
happened
feel
to
betrayed
who
by
must
Justin?
pay for it. Did she
And she
still
saw
carry
with
painful
anger
clarity
each time
who the
Janet
machine
stayed
had already
composed.
chosen to shield?
She dodged the bait.
People who later
She
spoke about
refused
those
to attack
weeks described
publicly.
Janet as composed
She
on the
refused to
outside
relive the moment
and
for the
quietly
cameras.
devastated underneath.
She refused to give the
She
media
did not
the
rage
dramatic
on television.
confrontation they were waiting
She did
for.
not publicly accuse
On the surface,
Justin.
it looked like
She
grace.
did what she had always done.
It looked like
She
closure.
calculated.
It looked like
According to
forgiveness.
accounts, she would later
Underneath it
confirm
was something
Janet
else
made a conscious
containment.
choice. She
People
would limit
close to
Justin's
Janet have said
involvement
that
in
her
the
silence
fallout.
was not about being
She
at
told
peace
him to
with what
speak
happened.
less, not more.
It was about
To let the
maintaining the
storm
only
burn
control
itself
she
out.
had left.
To allow
She
the
had
system
already
to do
learned
what
the
it
hard
always
way that
does
telling
in
the
a
full
scandal
truth does not
isolate
guarantee
the most
justice.
vulnerable, and
It
move
often
on.
guarantees more
That
punishment.
choice has often been
Each
misread
time
as
she considered
forgiveness.
speaking plainly,
It was
the
not.
same calculation
It was
returned.
recognition.
Who would benefit
Janet
from this,
recognized
and
that
who
the
would pay
machine
the
had
price.
already plotted its course.
For nearly 20 years,
She recognized
the
that
stayed the
Justin,
same.
whether he intended it or
As
not,
conversations
was being
about
protected
power
and
race
lifted by that
and
same
accountability,
system. Slowly
the
evolved
resentment
younger
that
audiences
followed was not
began
loud
to
or
re-examine the
theatrical.
2004
It was
incident
restrained,
from a new
focused, and
perspective.
deeply personal.
Articles, think
It was
pieces,
not
and
about the
documentaries
choreography
started
on
reframing
stage.
the moment.
It was about
not
the
as a
moment
simple shock
afterward,
stunt,
when
but
Justin
as a
Timberlake
stark
had a
example
choice to step
of how
forward
selectively
and share
punishment
the
is
weight,
applied in
or to
American
let the industry
entertainment.
step over her.
Janet did not leave
while he
this
walked away
reevaluation.
untouched.
She let
He
others
chose
connect
the safer
dots.
path.
She
And
watched
for Janet
quietly as the
Jackson,
story shifted
a
in the
woman who
public
had
eye.
built her entire life
Then, in
around preventing
2021,
exactly that kind
Justin
of
Timberlake
exposure and
issued
abandonment,
a public apology,
that choice cut
acknowledging
deeper
that he had
than any
benefited from a
tabloid
system
headline ever could.
that protected him
The Super Bowl
while
night,
harming others,
the move, the
including
silence,
Janet.
and the
The
betrayal.
apology was debated,
February
dissected,
1,
praised by some,
2004.
dismissed by others.
Reliant Stadium,
For
Houston,
Janet,
Texas.
it wasn't a cure.
By the time the
It
halftime
wasn't a
countdown
reset
hit
button.
zero that night,
It was
nothing
confirmation
about
proof
the atmosphere
that what she had
suggested
understood
disaster.
back in 2004,
Inside Reliant
standing
Stadium,
inside the blast
more
zone
than
alone,
70
was finally
people were
being
on their
said out
feet,
loud,
roaring over
years
the sound
later
of
when the
fireworks
damage was
and
already
woven
outside more than
150 million viewers.
In 2022,
when Janet addressed the situation in her own
scattered
documentary,
across living rooms,
her
bars,
tone
and
was
parties
calm,
all over the
and
country.
controlled.
Janet
She said they
Jackson
had
walked
moved
onto
on.
that field.
She did
The
not
way she
deny
had
the
walked
pain,
onto every major
but she
stage
refused
for
to turn
decades
that pain into a
prepared,
weapon.
composed, convinced
She
that every
refused to
detail
let the
had been
story be
accounted for.
reduced to a feud.
Every cue,
That is what makes
every
the
step,
hatred in this
every
story
camera
so
move
difficult
had been
to see.
rehearsed with military
It was never the
precision.
kind that explodes on
This was
social
not her
media.
first live performance.
It lived in the quiet spaces.
It was
in
not her
memory,
first
in comparison,
high-stakes show.
in the unspoken
And no one
knowledge of who
believed
was
it was
protected
supposed to be the
and who
last
was not.
moment she would ever
Janet
truly
Jackson
control.
did not spend
The
20
show
years
unfolded
plotting
exactly as the
revenge.
production team
She
had
spent
promised.
20 years remembering.
The lights hit on
remembering
cue.
who walked away
The dancers
untouched.
rotated through their
remembering
marks
whose
with
career grew
machine-like
stronger.
timing.
remembering how quickly the industry decided she could be sacrificed. Nothing about the performance
At the core
in
of
those
this
first
story
minutes felt
is
unstable.
not chaos,
When
not
Justin
public
Timberlake
rage,
stepped out
but
to
a
join
long,
her for the
disciplined
final section,
silence,
it looked
carrying
like
the
a
weight of a
symbolic
betrayal
passing of the torch
that never needed
the
to be
veteran icon,
shouted to be real.
and the younger star
In the
shoulder
end,
to shoulder
the man
sharing
Janet Jackson
what
came
had
to
become
hate.
the biggest annual
Most was
platform
not
in
simply
American
the one who was on
entertainment.
stage with her that
On
night,
camera there was no
but the
visible
one who
tension,
emerged from the scandal
no
unscarred
hesitation,
without ever truly standing
no obvious
beside
sign
her.
that anyone on that stage
Not because of a
believed they
single
were
movement
seconds
in
away
front of
from
a camera,
creating one of the most
but because when
dissected
everything
moments in
collapsed,
broadcast
he
history.
chose silent safety.
Then came the
and
final lyric.
self-preservation while she was
I'm
handed
gonna
to
have
the
you
system
naked by the
as
end
the
of
one
this
who would be
song.
punished.
The line was not
For 2
improvised.
decades, she watched
It had
Justin
been
Timberlake
performed in
collect
rehearsals.
trophies headlines.
It had
and
been
even
approved
another
by
Super Bowl
producers,
appearance,
reviewed by network
while her
standards,
name became a
and
warning
cleared in an
spoken
environment
behind
where
closed
every
doors,
second was scrutinized.
a reminder of what happens
It
when someone
existed
is
as
chosen
metaphor,
the
a
example.
suggestive punchline.
Her hatred was
designed
never
to push the edge
broadcast,
of
never
prime-time
sold in
respectability,
interviews, never
without
turned into a
crossing it.
spectacle.
What followed,
was
however, was
precise,
not metaphor.
Quiet,